All right, so let's set up our zombies so that they're just kind of standing around, and then if the player gets close enough to them, they'll turn to look at them, and then after a moment of looking at them, they start chasing them. So let's start off by sketching out our states. So in our state, after they randomly choose the model, we'll call this idle. Then I'm going to control click in the canvas to add another state. We'll call this one look at player. We'll call this wait, and then we'll call this chase player. Okay, so it'll be idling, look at the player, wait a second, and then start chasing them. So, of course, in this idle state, they're going to be kind of standing there, maybe a little bit of wiggling. And in the chase player state, they're going to be running, which means that we're going to need animation files, which is why we're heading over to Mixamo.com. Mixamo.com is free to use. You just got to set up an account there or use your Adobe account to log in. And when you're here, you're going to see an interface that looks like this. You're going to get their little default character model. You can also upload your own characters. But for now, we're just going to get the animations that we need and get out of here. So I'm going to type in idle up here. And I'm searching in the animations section. If I searched idle in the character section, nothing would pop up. So just make sure you're in the animation section. Let's just take this one. Clicked on this idle, and we get a little preview here. Okay, looks good to me. So I'll download this. And we'll skip the skin. We could just put without skin. Who needs skin? And then hit download. I don't need skin. Okay, and it's going to ask us where we want to put it. So in our assets, I'm going to make a new folder called 02_animations. I guess with 2 S's. Cool. And here's where I'm going to save the idle. And it'll just be called idle. All right, so now back in Unity, in our animations, we can see our FBX here. And when we click on it, over here in the inspector, we could see under this rig tab that the animation type is set to generic. We want to set this to humanoid and then hit apply. Go up here and hit configure. If I just hit F to zoom in on this, we can see that all these bones are green. It's not giving us any notifications, so everything looks good here. And I can just hit done. Okay, so that changes the settings for that. The reason I want this set to humanoid is because here in our zombie, if I go down to the zombie models game object, it already has an animator component loaded up and it has this avatar. And this avatar is the humanoid type. So in order to be compatible with this, and generally as a very universal sort of rule of thumb, if you're going to be animating a humanoid character, you may as well set it to humanoid. That way linking between these avatars is way easier. So I'm going to click this little arrow, and then this triangle right here, this Mixamo.com, I'm going to select that, and I'm going to hit Control D on Windows or Command D on Mac. It's going to duplicate it. Now I'm going to rename this to idle. So now this is its own little standalone animation file. I'm going to come up here and hit loop time, so it loops when it plays. And then over here in our zombie models, you'll see that it needs a controller to do something, but it doesn't really have one right now. So I'm going to right click in our animations folder, create Animator Controller. I'm going to call this zombie controller. Okay, so I'm going to select the zombie models again. I'm going to drag and drop that right into here. Cool. So now I'm going to double click on the controller so we can see what's inside of it. And we have these 3 conditions right now, but we're going to drag and drop our idle state in here, and that'll become the first state that it goes to by default. So you'll see here it starts at entry, and then the arrow goes straight to this. All right, looking good. So back in our scene, there's zombie selected. In our idle state, we can have an animator play action, and we're going to specify the game object as the zombie models, and the state that we want to go to will be idle. Now I just put a lowercase I in there. I want to make sure, yep, so it has to be spelled exactly the same way. So if you select the state, you can see up here, this is what the string reference will be. So you can also Control C or Command C to copy that, and then over here in the FSM, even though I know I spelled it right, as a precaution, pasting that back in, just like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit play to see this. Okay, great. And you can see our zombie is idling. Just kind of a little bit of movement, just breathing. Cool breathing, zombie. All right, so I'm going to stop this. That's all working now. And back in Mixamo, I'm just going to come in and grab a run animation. This one looks pretty good, but you'll see that this animation actually has them running across the screen. So you can check this little box for in place, and the animation will keep playing, but now they're not actually moving through space, which lets us control that aspect when we're programming them. So I'm going to go ahead and download that one, saving that in the animations. I'm just going to call it run, the lowercase r, and we'll get an attack animation as well. Okay, this zombie attack animation looks pretty good. I'm going to select this one and I'm going to hit download, and call this one attack with a lowercase a. All right, looking pretty good. And the last thing you want to do with these things is just select the FBXs. I'm control clicking them so I can select multiple. And then in the animation type, changing it to humanoid, hitting apply. And you can't do this next part in batches, so I'm just going to select the attack first. I'm going to hit configure. And all of that looks good to me. I'm going to hit done. And the run, same thing, hitting configure. All of it looks good. I'm going to hit done. Cool. So for attack, I'm going to duplicate that, rename it attack. I'm going to make sure it's looping. And then run, same thing, duplicating the animation part, make sure it's looping. I'm going to rename this to attack, and I'm going to rename this to run. Now, to keep tidy, I can also create a new folder, call this FBX backups. And I'm just going to put the FBXs in here so we only see our animation files. So we have attack, idle, and run. Okay, and they're all looping, and they're all set as humanoid animations. Great, so we're ready to add these in, but to get our zombie moving, we're going to need some pathfinding options, which we can get from the Playmaker ecosystem. Okay, to get the Playmaker ecosystem, you can come up here to Playmaker, Add-ons, Download Add-ons, take you to the page for add-ons, come over here to the ecosystem browser, and then download the ecosystem browser package. Okay, and then in assets, you could save this somewhere else. It doesn't necessarily have to go into your project. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in my packages. I'm going to save it there. Back in here, in my packages, double click on the ecosystem. And I'm going to import this. All right, once that's done, you can come over here to Playmaker, Add-ons, Ecosystem, Ecosystem Browser. Alternatively, you can hit Alt-E. So when you first fire it up, it'll give you this screen and gives you the disclaimer. I'm just going to go ahead and click this button, use the ecosystem. So the ecosystem is a place where you can find additional actions and packages to use with Playmaker. What we want today is the pathfinding package. So that's a whole package of actions to use to control Unity's built-in pathfinding system. So I'm going to type in pathfinding. Okay, there it is. It's selected. I'm going to hit get. So it's going to download the pathfinding package, and I can import that. Cool. You'll see it says imported now. So I'm just going to go ahead and close the ecosystem. And now you'll see that we have this NavMesh and NavMeshAgent section. These are two new sections that just got added. So these sections have actions that control Unity's built-in pathfinding system. So in our zombie idle state, we're going to put in a set agent is stopped. Okay, we're going to put that right at the top. Now it says here, game object requires AI NavMesh component. Click to add the required component. That means our zombie doesn't have the NavMeshAgent component on it. So you could click that and it'll just add it, right? There it is. I'm going to remove it though. Show you that you can also just type in NavMeshAgent, and it's this first one right here, NavMeshAgent. Okay, there it is. So the set agent is stopped action. We'll make sure that the agent, our zombie, is stopped as long as this box is checked. So I'm checking that box. That means he's standing still, and this idle animation is playing. Great. But we want our zombie to turn and look at the player if the player gets close enough. So what we could do is I'm going to go ahead and minimize that. And in our zombie game object, I'm going to right click on it, 3D object, and then sphere. So we create a sphere right at the base of our zombie. I'm going to call this proximity bubble. Oops, bubble. and then I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. This is about the distance that the player will have to enter for the zombie to take notice of them. We can go ahead and turn off this mesh collider. So you can see that's about the distance. And on this sphere collider part, I'm going to put is trigger. Okay, so now here in our zombies FSM, we're going to put in a trigger event action. And this trigger event action will send an event when something comes into this bubble. So we're going to leave this to on trigger enter, and it'll only fire off for things tagged as player. Now you'll see that it says game object requires rigid body or collider. That's because it's taking it from our zombie right now. So we're going to change this to specify the game object, and we're going to drag in our proximity bubble. Okay, there we go. And then it'll send the event entered zone. We'll add that event. And it'll send off down here to look at the player. Now, if you hold control while you're dragging your states around, they'll snap to an invisible grid, and that way you can keep things nice and tidy. I'm going to put it something like this. Kind of change this as we go along, but for now, when they come to this state, look at player, we'll have them use a smooth look at. Okay, and the target object will be the player. But we could just drag and drop the player in here, and that'll work just fine. But the moment we turn this zombie game object into a prefab, it won't be able to reference scene objects in the same way. So what we'll have to do is set a variable. So this new variable will be called player, and we'll get around to setting that in just a moment. But for now, it'll be smoothly looking at the player, and we'll change this finish tolerance to something like 0.1, so they're almost always looking straight at them, and we'll change the speed down to something slower, like 3, and we'll keep that vertical. All that looks pretty good to me. So once they've reached that point where they're basically looking at the player, we'll have that send another event that we can call next, add that transition in, and that'll fire off to the next state where they wait. And in this wait state, we're going to have the same smooth look at. So I'm going to copy and paste this in here. But what we'll do is we'll change the speed to something like 10. That way they're really just looking at them no matter where the player moves around now. And then we'll just remove this event, change that to none. And while they're looking at them, they're going to wait a moment. So we could put in a wait action. And here they'll wait 2 whole seconds. And after that wait is up, we'll send next, add that in, and that's when they will chase the player. Okay, now in this chase state, we can add in another animator play. And again, we want to specify this model's game object. This time, the animator state that we'll want will be our run animation. So I'm going to drag and drop this run animation in here. And while we're here, I'm also going to drag and drop in our attack animation. Okay, it's good to stick to a naming convention. All of these I've tried to keep to a single word, and they're all spelled with a lowercase first letter. So back in our zombie FSM, I could just type in run, the lowercase r. So it'll be playing that, and then we'll have a set agent destination as game object. So this will tell our NavMeshAgent component to follow the player. The destination game object, again, will have to be this variable that we haven't set yet. Right now, this is an empty game object, so we should actually just take care of that right now by turning this zombie game object into a prefab. That way we can start getting an idea of how we should set up these systems. So in assets, I'm going to create a new folder, 03 underscore prefabs. And in prefabs, I'm going to create a new folder called zombie. And in here is where I'm going to drag and drop our zombie game object, which then turns this into a prefab. There's a pretty easy way we can have this prefab reference the player, and that's just by going over to our player and in, let's see, which one of these? We could just add in a new component to our player. Type in FSM, and we'll call this info. And in the info FSM on our player, call this first state init for initialization, and we'll have a get owner action. So it's going to get this player game object and it's going to store it. into a new variable or a new global variable. And this is kind of the easy hack to let all these prefab zombies reference the player. So we're going to make it a new global variable, and this will just be called player. We're saying okay. Oh wait. So now in the zombie prefabs, when they look at player, another way we could have set that up is by storing the collider in our trigger event. So we could have stored that as player, but we don't want to have to always rely on these kind of things when we know there's only one player in this game. This is left one dead after all. Instead, I'm just going to go ahead and go to our variables tab. I'm going to get rid of this player variable by clicking that X. Sure you want to delete it. It's used 3 times, and I'm saying yes, I do. And what's nice about that is that we can now just go to our globals and select player. So the smooth lookout will look at that. Same thing with the weight, changing that, going to globals, player, and then even in chase player, the destination will be globals player. Okay, so if I move our zombie up ahead, just outside of the bubble, right? So we'll just have to move forward a little bit. And let's make sure our player is tagged as such. So we have our character controller on, but we want this tag to be player. Let's hit play. Okay, so I'm going to move forward. He sees us, he turns around, he stays looking at us no matter which way. Oh, but then it crashes. He's just about to start running. Good start, right? But the set destination as game object says set destination can only be called on an active agent that has been placed on a NavMesh. And that is because we have not set up our actual NavMesh in the scene. So let's stop the scene. I'm going to show you how to set up a NavMesh in your world. Now, NavMeshes are pretty straightforward. Essentially, they're just surfaces by which our NavMesh agents can traverse across. They tell you where they can't go and where they can go, where they can jump to, and all that sorts of stuff. What we'll do is we'll select some of these pieces of the world, these streets. We're just going to do this as a small example because we're going to have to go through this whole level and select the parts for the NavMesh. But for now, with these pieces selected, I'm going to come over here to Window, AI, Navigation, and with these tiles selected, I'm going to go over and click Navigation Static, and you'll see that it says Walkable right here. And I'm going to move over to the Bake tab. I'm going to hit Bake. And you'll see that they just got covered with this blue mesh surface. Now, all this blue mesh surface is where the NavMesh agent can traverse across. So now if we wanted to run our game, this should work a little bit better. I'm gonna hit play. Okay, so I'm gonna move towards them. They see us. And okay, so he's running. But so I'm gonna go ahead and pause it to see what the problem is. And I'm gonna minimize this environment, select our zombie, and let's see what's going on here. So what we forgot to do is when he starts running again, forgot to set the inverse of this. The set agent is stopped. We need to set it to not stopped now. So let's stop the scene and we'll hop into the prefab, come over to idle. I'm going to select this state. I'm going to copy it and paste it in here in the chase player, except when I put it here at the top, I'm going to deselect this is stopped. And now he should chase after us. So he sees us, looks at us, and chases after us. He's a little slow right now. So what we could do is when he starts chasing after us, we could change his move speed. And also you'll see that he rotates a little slowly. So even though his run animation is running fast, there are times where his back is almost turned at us. Now we solve this by changing his parameters in the NavMesh agent. So if I select him and then come over here to the NavMesh agent component, his angular speed, we could just crank that up something like 1,000. So now he'll just turn around very quickly and he just always faces in the direction that he's running. And actually, come to think of it, you only really change the speed when something actually has different run speeds, say between walking and running. But for our zombies, they're always running. So we could just change the speed to something like 5. So let's see how this feels. Okay, she has our attention. And, okay, turning around much quicker. See that? And also running a little faster. Now, if I move past where the NavMesh ends, you'll see that she isn't able to traverse it. That's because our NavMesh hasn't been set up or baked across the rest of the environment. That's a tedious process, and you're not going to want to watch me do it, and you're going to have to take a minute to do it yourself as well. But I'm going to show you one more thing before I let you go and take care of your environment's NavMesh. So I'm going to stop the game, and what you need to know when you're creating your NavMeshes is that if I select navigation, you could see the NavMesh, and if I select some more of these objects to make them traversable, I select object, navigation static, and set them as walkable. But if I select this car and this car and this car, navigation static, and I'm just going to say yes, change their children as well, because that includes the tires of the car. I can change this to not walkable. So it's going to say that all of these cars and their children, which means their tires, I'm going to say yes, change the children, cannot be walked on. So I just said these floors right here, you should be able to walk across, and these cars you cannot. And now when I come over to the bake tab and hit bake to update our NavMesh, you'll see that these nice convenient holes have been cut out around the vehicles. Okay? So now you can go ahead and go through your level and decide which parts of the environment you want your zombies to be able to navigate across. Go take care of that, and then we'll move on to the next part.